took a look with respect to some of the core concepts with respect to the Active Directory. And on that aspect, we were covering the applications or the app registrations, or what we call as the service principles. So in that, we discussed that service principle is like one can consider a service principle or an app registration as an equivalent to a service account, but with certain set of limitations. So in the technical terminology, in case if I have to state, an Azure service principal is basically a security identity used by the created applications, services, and automation tools to access certain specific Azure resources. So one can consider it as a user identity similar to a login and a password or a certificate that we had seen with a specific role and tightly controlled permission to access your resources. Let me change my hotspot. Give me 1 minute.
I thought there's a problem with my network.
So a service principal can be considered as a cloud version of the service account. So on that aspect, under app registrations in the Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Entra ID, there is a concept of registering an application. So in that, I have to click on new registration. I can provide any name. Now, we had seen that the name, I can have duplicate names, but a unique client ID gets associated to that. Hence, any automation aspect or anything that needs to be done needs to be on the basis of the client ID or the application ID that we take a look. So in this scenario, I already have a service account demo and a service, two app registration apps with the similar name. Now, how to register an app? Provide an app name. Then in our case, since we want it within the single tenant itself, we do not want a multi-tenant aspect. This is similar. And then we register it. Once we register the application, a unique ID gets associated to that in the form of application or the client ID. This acts as the username equivalent of the corresponding service principal. Now, we took a look with respect to the user ID. Now, what about the credential aspect? So for that, under certificates and secrets, one can create multiple passwords for the same username. Like I can have multiple client secrets created with expiration duration. For the same service principal. Now, as of now, since both of the client secret have a future expiration date, both of them are active, meaning I can log in, I can authenticate this service principal either via this credential or this credential. Now, one of the core aspect of the client secret is once you create a client secret, you need to copy it instantly and preserve it in some location called Azure Key Vault that we will discuss in a couple of next sessions. Because once you refresh the page, then the client secret value gets encrypted and even the administrator cannot regenerate the original value. So in that case, one has to delete it. Once you delete the client secret, even if the expiration duration is of future, it's like the that corresponding password becomes inactive or disabled. Now, federated credential is the highest security form of a service principal, but that is more on with respect to some of the Azure DevOps aspect that we will discuss in subsequent sessions. And certificates is like a certificate that you create and upload it. But unfortunately, not all Azure offerings and Microsoft Fabric offerings support service principal certificate authentication. Most of them support service principal client secret authentication. Hence, our focus would be on the client secret aspect. Then we took a look with respect to API permissions. Now we saw that API is like an is an interface for us to do certain operations on the source aspect. Now, Microsoft itself has multiple internal APIs for their internal tools like Power BI, SharePoint, Microsoft Graph, etc. There can be some organization-specific APIs or project-specific APIs. So in that, I need to, in case if I want to provide a specific API permission, I need to click on Add Permission. Now, in this case, if I have to provide this app permission on, let's say, Power BI service. Now, here you can see that there are two types of permission. Now, the delegated permission, as the name suggests, is basically the application needs to access the API as a signed-in user. Meaning, the application, there are two ways of delegated aspect, correct? An application can be used as a bridge between an end user and an application. So in case if the end user has the necessary access on the API and the destination, then only he would be able to access that API. That is what we call as the delegated permission. Or the other way is, imagine I'm doing some automation with the app. The app has the necessary access on the Power BI, let's say workspace. Then only it would be able to get that list. In yesterday's example, in an organization, there can be multiple SharePoint sites. Now, in case of a delegated permission, I can only let's take a look at delegated permission. In this case, if I give it app.read_all, meaning read all. Okay, let me go back to the SharePoint itself. So, in case of a delegated permission, even if I give it all sites.full control, it won't be able to access all the sites until and unless it has specific access within that site. Meaning, I need to grant that site, grant that service principal and access within that site. Then only this full control is like give full control on all these sites that it has already access to. That is delegated permission. Whereas the application permission is, it's like an admin. Irrespective of whether it has access or not, it would have complete access on all the SharePoint sites. Your application runs as a background service without a signed-in user, meaning there is no authorization happening. By default, we are authorizing it as a full admin access itself. These are the different API permissions. So we covered the application registrations, creating secrets, and granting different API permissions to an app. Then in the Active Directory, we went across, see, the app registration section was to register an application and to generate its corresponding credentials. Now, in case of enterprise applications, I get the list of all the applications that are present within the corresponding tenant. Now, those applications can be the app registrations that we did, or the internal applications like what we call as managed identity. I'll come to Microsoft applications a little later. The managed identity aspect. Now, what do we mean by managed identity? Unlike app registration, wherein I had to explicitly create a a client secret, a credential for authentication purposes. In case of managed identity, what happens is any Azure offering that we create, for that we in certain offerings by default an identity gets associated or imprinted in the Active Directory. Like in this case, when I created an Azure Data Factory, by default an identity of this stature, that is managed ID demo, got created within the managed identity section. And similarly, so we saw for Azure Data Factory, automatically a system assigned managed identity got created. Whereas for the SQL Server, I had to explicitly enable a system assigned managed identity. In the identity section, I had to turn on this functionality. Post turning on this functionality, I was able to see the corresponding Azure SQL DB network in the managed identity applications. So in this case, if you see, for the corresponding application, the certification expiration status is managed by Microsoft. What do I mean by that? Let me go to app registrations. In app registrations, you all can see, correct, certification and secret. So in this case, for these two service principals, I have created either a certificate or a secret which is in expired state based on the expiration duration that we had provided. But in case of managed identity, the Microsoft internally takes care of rotating the credentials. We need not worry about that. Hence, that's the most secure form of authentication that one can think of in the Microsoft ecosystem. Managed identity, wherein Microsoft is managing the identity of all the offerings. Now, as I stated, correct, different Azure offerings can have managed identities associated with that. Now, there are two types of managed identity. A system assigned managed identity. As the name suggests, the identity that is assigned via the system name. And what is the system name? The offering name that we created. Now in Azure Data Factory, the name must be unique globally, meaning in case if I have an Azure Data Factory by the name X, no one else can use that name X. But in Azure SQL database, I can still use the name X because these are two different offerings. And in both of them, I can enable system assigned managed identity. So similar to app registrations, even system assigned managed identity can have a duplicate name, but it's the ID, the application ID that uniquely defines that corresponding application at an application level. This is managed identity. Now, there are two types of managed identity. One is a system assigned managed identity that we already discussed, that whatever name I have granted for the Azure offering, for that name itself becomes the managed identity itself. Now, in case if I turn off this managed identity, does it mean the corresponding managed identity within this application would be removed? Or let's say let's say I also deleted both the Azure Data Factories, correct? That is managed identity demo, etc. So I'm deleting these two resources. So now, in this case, would the managed identity be deleted from the application status? Any thoughts? Okay. So in that case, basically, let's go and take a look. Since I deleted the corresponding Azure offerings, the corresponding managed identity also gets auto-deleted. since that is a system assigned managed identity that we have provided. And since I disabled it or I deleted it, that application got deleted from the Active Directory. Now, this is system assigned managed identity. Now there is something called as a user assigned managed identity, wherein I can have a unique ID created and associate that ID to all the Azure offerings. I come to this concept, system assigned managed, a user assigned managed identity in tomorrow's session in detail when we discuss on the concept of assigning roles and assignments. And what is the benefit of using a system user assigned managed identity over system assigned managed identity. But do remember that certain Azure offerings supports only system assigned managed identity, like the Azure Data Factory, whereas in certain cases, you have a flexibility to switch across between a system assigned managed identity or a specific user assigned managed identity. So before we proceed ahead, any queries? Ramesh?
Yeah, Nandan, I wanted to understand, like through app registration, we used to create like what we say, like a service principal, right?
App registration is one the service principal itself, correct?
Yeah. So like any other activity we do through app registration, or only we create user ID like service principal.
It's app, as the name suggests, registering an app. So it's only for
Yeah.
registering an app and making changes in the properties of that applications like API permissions, secret management, role assignments, etc. So it's
Okay.
majorly with respect to applications.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yes, Anamika.
Yeah. So when all do we use system assigned managed identity versus user defined managed identity? What scenarios?
So Anamika, that I'll cover tomorrow when we
Okay.
actually understand the concept of roles and assignment. Correct?
Okay.
But the aspect is not every Azure offering supports
Managed
user
identity.
assigned managed identity. By default, it
Okay.
creates like the one we saw in Azure Data Factory, correct? But in case of this Azure SQL Server, I'm able to see that it is giving me a choice between a system and a user assigned.
Okay.
Now, in layman terminology, if I have to explain, considers user assigned managed identity similar to a group, correct? What I mean by group is, imagine that I have to provide 5 different users the same set of access, correct? So I
Okay.
can individually add those 5 users in the access. Let's say database access or something, correct? But now those 5 individual users are like, in case of system assigned managed identity, it is like this name itself. And let's say these names can be unique or different.
Mm.
Agree?
Mm.
Now I have to add this 5 different times, or I can create a security group, add these 5 applications within that security group and give that security group access. But in that, I have an extra responsibility of managing a security group as well. Correct?
Correct.
So rather than that, what I can do is I can create an identity, a user assigned identity, meaning I'll specifically define an identity, let's say X. I'll assign that X to all the 5 different resources that need a similar access. So for every resource, I assign that same identity X, and I gave that X access on that database, automatically
Ah.
granting them the
Okay.
5 individual offerings access.
Okay.
Clear?
Okay. So basically, you are saying that this is an identity or this is a persona, and then you are assigning that persona to everyone.
A single user assigned managed identity can be shared across multiple resources. So I can
Mm-hmm.
assign the same identity to multiple folks, and I'll be granting that identity access, thereby ensuring that all the multiple folks would have access.
Mm-hmm. Now that can be a user also, and that can be an application also, right?
No, user assigned managed identity is only for the applications or Azure offerings, not for a user.
Okay. Okay.
It's
got
an
it.
identity,
Got it.
identity for offerings or resources.
Offerings or resources of. Okay. Got it. Thanks.
Yes, Shweta?
Nandan, I just missed for 5 seconds. What's the difference between a service principal then and a user assigned managed identity? Because in both cases we are creating it.
In case of user assigned managed identity, okay, since you all are asking it, let me show as well. Correct. In the Azure Active, there is something called as managed identities that you all can search. Correct. In the managed identity, I have to register, I have to create a managed identity first. Correct. Now that managed identity need not have any specific client secret created. It's like an identity that I'm creating within the Microsoft, wherein it would internally discuss across one another. No need of a credential involved in between. Whereas in case of a service principal, you have to provide a credential for authentication, and that credential can be in form of the secrets or the certificates.
Okay,
Clear?
got it.
So in managed identity, I select for which specific resource group within that I want to create it. Correct. So in this case, let me create an expert. I'll provide a name, test MI. Correct. And I'm creating this. Did anywhere I had to provide anything, the client secret, etc.? No. Correct. So now an identity is getting created, and now I can leverage this identity within the user assigned managed identity section. These are some of the advanced aspects that you all need not have with respect to the Microsoft Fabric, but for senior folks within the organization as a data folks, it is necessary not only to understand Fabric, but the entire ecosystem altogether. So now a managed identity got created. It takes time to be present here, test MI. Now I can go and assign a user assigned managed identity here. I can see that there is one user assigned managed identity, and I can use it across everywhere. Nowhere is there a need of a credential, wherein now this server would internally communicate with wherever I have given access internally, and Microsoft would take care of internal authentication. We need not provide any explicit credentials to it. Clear? Any other queries?
So what are the advantages or disadvantages of both? Like when should we use managed identity and service principal, and where?
As I said, managed identity is the highest form of security that one can leverage because there are no credentials involved. Correct. But unfortunately, not all Azure offerings support managed identity authentication.
Okay.
In case of Microsoft Fabric, there are certain sources or certain offerings that only support service principal and client secret authentication. They do not have managed identity authentication. So wherever managed identity authentication is there, you should always leverage that because that is the highest form of authentication. But then, unfortunately, not every offering has matured to that level to support managed identity authentication. So that, unfortunately, you are bound with client ID, client secret authentication itself.
Okay.
Now, thank you for bringing that question. Correct. Imagine, correct. Now I need to understand how much your concepts across last 3 days are clear. Imagine that I have an Azure offering that supports managed identity authentication. Correct. But still, in what case would I be enforced to use a service principal authentication over managed identity authentication?
If you're communicating with other than Microsoft application, Azure application, like third-party application.
No, see, for third-party applications, unfortunately, they would provide their own way of credentials. Correct. Then neither service principal nor managed identity authentication might come in. Correct. Or in case if you are able to provide access to a service principal, then you can even provide access to a managed identity, because both are applications within the tenant. Correct. So in what case would I be enforced to use a service principal authentication, irrespective of whether it is supporting service principal authentication or not? You can try out.
Would it be calling REST APIs, API permissions?
No, a REST API, as I said, correct. In case if you are able to allow a service principal access to an API, it means you can even allow a managed identity, because both are
Okay.
enterprise application only, correct? That's what we saw, correct? Both are enterprise applications within the Azure Active Directory.
Correct.
So if I'm able to give access to one, I should be able to give access to the other as well.
Okay. Not sure.
Consider something called as a tenant on the tenant aspect. Now, the managed identity is bounded to the tenant, correct? Meaning, let's take an example, correct? I have the Azure Data Factory. Now, this Azure Data Factory, correct, is present in the YLDF7 tenant. So, the corresponding managed identity of this ADF is present within this tenant, that is YLDF7. In sync with me up till now? Now, imagine that I want to access an Azure SQL database that is in some another tenant. Let's say tenant Y. My Azure Data Factory, which has a managed identity, is present in tenant X, and I have an Azure SQL database which is in tenant Y. Now, for me to grant access to this ADF into this database, can I grant it? No, correct, because both are in different tenants. So in case if both are in different tenants, even though the ADF supports managed identity authentication to this database, I'm not able to add that identity within the database because this is cross-tenant. So in that case, what I have to do is, in the other tenant wherein the Azure SQL database is present, I need to create a service principal and its corresponding credential and use that in this tenant's ADF. So even though Azure Data Factory supports managed identity and service principal authentication to an Azure SQL database, in this case, due to cross-tenant aspect, I'm enforced to use service principal authentication over managed identity authentication, because managed identities cannot travel between tenants. It's an identity within this corresponding tenant itself. Clear?
Yes. And then just one thing, that service principal, when we create that time, you had shown there were 4 radio buttons. So we have to select the multi-tenant option while creating that service principal, right? So that it can go across tenants.
No, Shweta. Correct.
Not
See,
okay.
the Azure SQL database is in this tenant. Correct. Now, the service principal that you're creating is within this tenant itself. That is the Azure SQL database. Correct. So, I am using a username and a password to connect this database. So, why is there a concept of cross-tenant? There is no cross-tenant, correct? Because the service principal is also of the same tenant and the database is also of the same tenant. While connecting to a database, you need not provide the tenant aspect, correct? And this in the ADF, as long as you provide the server name, the database name and the credential, it does not matter in which tenant the database is. Understood?
Okay.
But the managed identity cannot travel across tenant. Hence, I could not grant this managed identity, the ADF in tenant X, to the database in tenant Y. Hence, I was enforced to use a service principal. Clear?
Got it, got it. Yes, yes.
So there are multiple scenarios wherein one has to still leverage client service principal authentication itself, client ID, client secret authentication itself, and cannot rely on the managed identity, irrespective of managed identity being the best authentication aspect. Am I clear up till now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Now, team, as and when we move, I'll be interconnecting all our previous discussions with the latest discussions. So there might be some confusion. In case if you all are not able to grasp, do query at that time itself. Correct? So now, in the enterprise applications, we saw the apps that we created. We saw managed identity. What does Microsoft applications mean? Now, Microsoft in itself has specific set of offerings, correct? Like, let's say, Key Vault, Azure Key Vault, or Power BI, Power BI Service, Power BI Premium. These are internal Microsoft application, or let's say Intune, Microsoft Intune, correct? Now, for all the corresponding Microsoft application, there is a unique application ID that is getting created, and also something called as identifier URI. URI stands for Unique Resource Identifier. Uniquely identify the corresponding Microsoft resources. So in this case, let's take Azure Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault has these two unique identifiers, like the client the GUID ID, which is equivalent to the application ID, if you all see, and then https://vault.azure.net. So this is like a unique identifier stating that it's an Azure Key Vault. Now, why do we need this? Correct? It is because this aspect, if you all remember in the agenda, there is a last aspect called automation via REST APIs. Correct? This concept would be leveraged there. What do I mean by that? Today, I'll be providing a brief understanding, and in the end states, I'll be actually clarifying what does that actually mean. As I said, most of the Microsoft offerings have a REST API for some automation purposes. So now let's take an example that I want to automate, or I want to get a list of everything in the Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault, we will take a look tomorrow or on Monday. Consider it as a tijori, a treasure, a locker. Correct? Within the locker, you would preserve all your secrets or credentials. Now, in case if I want the list of all, what are the different list that is present, I can manually scan across the locker, or I can write an automation way. That automation way is leveraging the REST APIs. Now, to leverage a REST API, I need to authenticate it. So while authenticating, I need to generate something called as a token. It's like a handshake. Consider that I first need to generate a token, provide that token, and generate a handshake in a layman terminology if I have to state. Now, the token that needs to be created needs to be a token specific to that corresponding Azure offering. Correct? The REST API in which. So in case if I have to automate something from the Azure Key Vault, I have to generate a token for that unique identifier in Microsoft via Active Directory. And that's where we need this identifier URI, because I'll be generating a token in the Active Directory via some account for this corresponding resource. It can be a Key Vault, it can be Intune, it can be Power BI service, etc. So that is the concept of identifier URI. And these are the Microsoft applications. Microsoft applications are nothing but Microsoft offerings, every Microsoft offering has its own unique application ID and a unique identifier. This provides the list of that. So up till now in Active Directory, we saw users, groups, and different types of applications: enterprise application, managed identity applications, and Microsoft applications. Correct? In everywhere I said application ID or the client ID is the unique ID under managed identity, etc. But let me go to groups. In group, every group is having something called as an object ID. Correct? Now, every user is having an individual object ID. Then every application is having an object ID. So can anyone tell me what can be the difference between an object ID and an application ID? Try, at least you all can try, correct?
Object ID would be the identity column for every entity, I believe.
When you say
Whenever
for
it
every
is there.
entity, can you be more specific? What do you mean by entity here?
Entity means the object, right? Let's say user, right? User is an entity, right? Or the and the application is the another entity.
Correct. You're somewhat nearer to the aspect.
Yeah, whenever it is creating, right, it is creating a unique record for everything, means every entity.
So basically, object ID is a unique ID entirely across Active Directory. So anything that would be created in Active Directory would have a corresponding object ID. And that object ID uniquely represents that corresponding object in the entire Active Directory. Whereas application ID is the IDs only for the applications. So application ID is unique for the applications only. An application ID can overlap with an object ID, but it does not mean the application ID and the object ID overlap for the same object. Meaning, I can have an object ID that can be similar to an application ID of some other application. So in layman terminology, if I have to state, object ID is the unique ID entirely across entire Active Directory for any components that are created within the Active Directory. Whereas application ID, as the name suggests, are application specific IDs, and there are these types of applications that have the corresponding IDs. For users or groups, at any point, do we see any of the corresponding application ID? No, because these are not applications, these are objects. Any queries?
So Nandan, let's suppose we have Key Vault and ADF. Okay, so that application ID can be same for both, like multiple Key Vault.
No, application ID is basically a managed identity in this case, correct? Managed identity name can be duplicate, but the IDs are always unique for applications. There cannot be two applications having the same application ID, but there can be two applications having the same application name, because uniqueness is defined at an ID level, not at the name level.
Yeah, so object ID and application ID both will be unique only, correct? Cross.
No, see, object ID is like an identity at an Active Directory level, correct? So consider that as a user, I got created first. My application ID, my object ID would be 1, correct? Because object ID is an ID at the Active Directory level. Now imagine that I created a first application. So that first application can have an application ID 1, but a different object ID, because object ID 1 has already been taken over by the user. Understood?
Okay. Okay. Got it.
So this covers the crux of Active Directory, users, applications, and groups. Now, in groups, under security groups, I can not only add the users, but I also can add applications or the service principals. What I mean by that is, within this security group, correct? Under members, basically I have added a service principal, not a user. You all can see, correct? Type service principal. So a security group can have other group. Can you see? It can have, I can add different users, different groups, different devices, and applications within the corresponding security group. Meaning I can have a nested group that can even host service principals. Now with respect to Microsoft 365 group, I can only add members or a users. I cannot add another group or service principal or devices. That's another difference between a security group and a Microsoft 365 group. I hope now you all are able to understand the differences between the M365 and the security group to a much more clear extent post our discussion across last couple of sessions. So a security group can have another group, service principals, and users, whereas M365 group can be email enabled and can only add users, it cannot add any other group or service principals or applications. So this covers most of the aspects with respect to the Azure Active Directory. So before we move to the concept of roles, administrators, etc., any queries? Okay. So now moving to the next aspect, that is roles and administrators. Now, within the Active Directory, there are multiple inbuilt roles that are present. Now, those roles vary from the admin role to a reader role. Correct? So, in case if I filter out administrator, depending on different set of scopes, there are different administrator roles available. Like there are administrator roles for billing aspect. You saw, correct? In the subscription, we had seen a billing section in the initial session. So there can be a user assigned the billing administrator role wherein he or she can control the billing aspects within the subscription. There can be multiple fabric administrator role, global administrator role. For us, the focus is on two administrator role. The fabric administrator role, wherein in case if a user has been assigned a fabric administrator role, he or she can manage all aspects of Microsoft Fabric. Now, Microsoft Fabric also has a separate URL similar to portal.azure.com. To access Microsoft Fabric, there is another URL. Microsoft Fabric has its own admin portal as well, similar to how we saw the License Admin Center, correct? Similarly, Microsoft Fabric also has its own admin portal. In case if a user wants to have admin access, he or she must have this Fabric administrator role at the Active Directory level. Now, global administrator is the one who can manage all aspects of this Microsoft Entra ID, meaning the changes that we are doing. And similarly, there is different set of roles. These are admin roles. Similarly, there can be reader role, wherein global reader, the user can just read all the aspects but cannot modify anything. So these are the different set of roles that are available within the organization.
Sorry to interrupt. Global admin can have the Fabric admin privileges, right? Or does it?
No. Global admin is admin within the Azure Active Directory, not the Fabric. One has to have explicit Fabric admin role in order for him or her to have the Fabric administrator.
But global admin can access Teams admin center, SharePoint admin center, licenses and all.
Correct, because those are all part of licensing. Everything earlier was part of Azure Active Directory itself. But eventually Microsoft split them across separate aspects for better ease of management. Whereas Microsoft Fabric is a separate concept altogether. So one has to have a Fabric administrator role in order to be admin within the Fabric. Now, there are certain custom roles that I can declare. Custom roles meaning, as of now, this global administrator role has certain permissions. Rather than granting all the permission, I can only have a subset of permission defined, and I can define my own custom role. But to create custom role, an organization needs Microsoft Entra ID Premium P1 or P2 license. You cannot use a free trial license. And ours is a free trial license. Hence, we won't be able to proceed with the custom role creation. So we saw different roles. Now, let me go to the subscription. So those roles were Active Directory roles. Correct. Now, within the subscription, there is something called as access control IAM. It is to control the access. Here, there is something called as role assignment. What are the different roles that are available? I can see there is owner, contributor, reader, and some other aspects as well. Correct. But is there anything called admin? Administrator. Let me search for global administrator. Okay, why am I not seeing global administrator here? I was able to see global administrator there. Correct. It is because these are two different set of roles and permissions that we are discussing now. The first set that we saw, that was under the Active Directory roles and administrators, wherein these roles are roles within the Active Directory. So in case if I want anyone within my organization to have certain aspects within the Active Directory, I come across these set of roles. Whereas subscription and Active Directory are different concepts, correct? Subscription is a part of a tenant. Active Directory is also part of a tenant, correct? So the roles that we are seeing here, that is under the subscriptions, are roles for that corresponding subscription. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. So within the subscription, there are different set of roles like owner, meaning the user who has been granted owner role would have full access to manage all resources across this subscription. Then similarly, there are other different roles. And I can even create some custom roles for the same. Now let's understand what is the difference between these two. Imagine I create a new user. Imagine I join an imagine I add someone in my organization, Data Sharks. Now, so first step is I have to, okay, let's follow that step, correct? So whenever a user joins an organization, first step is we have to create a new user for that, correct? Then I'll set certain properties in case if I want dynamic group allocation. Next comes assignment. So basically I want to add what role should the user have within the corresponding Active Directory. So it is this set that we had skipped, correct? So today post the session, I need you all to create 2 users. When I say 2 users, first you would already be logged in with a user that is already a global administrator, correct? So then create 2 users. One user needs to have global administrator role and fabric administrator role.
Same user, global admin and fabric admin.
Correct. So one user that you would be creating should have global administrator and a fabric administrator role. Correct. And then I'll review and create this user. Would have the fabric administrator role and the global administrator role, meaning he or she can make changes in the Active Directory and in the fabric admin portal as well. So this role that we assigned at a user level is for the Active Directory. But an organization would also have multiple subscriptions. Now, in order for me to give that user, so I gave that new user access at the entire Active Directory, but I'm yet to give him or her access on the subscription. So for that, you have to go to the subscription. Under access control IAM, correct? Click on add role assignment. Now I want to grant the user whom you provided the global administrator and the fabric administrator the entire admin or the owner role within the subscription as well. Correct? So how to go again? Go to the subscriptions. Within the subscription, go to the subscription name, and under that go to access control. There we have to click on add and add a role assignment. In role assignment, I want to give him owner role, which is a privileged role. These are normal roles. These are privileged set of roles. So for that, I'll select owner. Now, whom do I need to give that owner role? I can give it to a user group or a service principal or managed identity, but I want to provide it to the new user that I created, meaning that you all would be creating, correct? So then select the corresponding user, the new user that you created. Then next, here, allow users to only assign selected roles to service principals. And this is a mandatory aspect, select roles and principal. So you can select that constrain all roles and save. A condition is required for restricted delegation aspect because I didn't add the corresponding condition here. What condition I need to have? And then I'll be able to configure the corresponding user with the owner role. So the access control IAM like owner, contributor, etc. These are the different set of roles that are present within the subscription and components within the subscription. So there are two sets of roles. One is Active Directory roles, another is Azure subscription roles. Active Directory roles are the main two roles that we need is Global Administrator and Fabric Administrator. Whereas in case of Azure subscription roles, as and when we go across, we would see different types of roles and permissions that are available. So first task that I expect you all to do is create one user within your Active Directory, within your tenant that would have Global Administrator and Fabric Administrator role and should have owner access on the subscription. Then once you create that, in an incognito window, try logging to portal.azure.com via that new account that you have created. Of course, you'll have to enable MFA. You will get the pop-up once you log in because Microsoft has enforced MFA on all the accounts. Then you would be able to see that the same set of changes that you could do via the current account that you have logged in, you would also be able to do it via the new account. Then create another account via the new account that created, because the new account now has the global administrator role. Create another user within the Active Directory that would only have, that won't have any privilege role in the Active Directory. Correct? Meaning just create a blank user, do not add any privilege within that. And then do not give that new user any access on the subscription as well. Or let me take one step back. First, do not add any privilege for that new user. Let it be blank user and create it. Then try to log in an incognito mode to portal.azure.com via the second user that you created. That under subscriptions, you won't be able to see anything because we have not granted anything to that user. And also try to go to the Active Directory and try to create some new user. You won't be able to create it because the new user does not have global administrator privileges. The second user that you are creating. So that would confirm to you all some aspect between the Active Directory role and the subscription role, because neither you all would be able to see any subscription, nor you all would be able to add any new groups or users or service principals within the Active Directory. Then edit the user. How to edit the user? Under user, go to the user and here click on edit properties. There, okay, let's ignore edit properties. I won't confuse you. Let's go to the direct aspect. Correct? So any queries up till now what we discussed? So you have to create two new users. First user that you create should have global administrator, fabric administrator role in Active Directory. Then via subscription access control IAM, you give him that new user owner access. Post that, login to portal.azure.com via that new account. Step 1 done. Step 2 is create another user logging via the first user that you created, because you would be able to create because you now have global administrator role. Just create a user without any privilege, anything. Then try to log into portal.azure.com via the second new user that you created. There, the conclusion should be you should neither be able to create any application registrations, nor you would be able to see any subscriptions. Once you confirm on that, then via the global administrator user, go to that corresponding second user and under assigned roles, it takes some time for assigned role to pop up, correct? Let's give 1 minute. Under assigned roles, we need to go and add the global administrator role. It's after one-time logging in and verification. Let's wait for a couple of minutes for the assigned roles to pop up. Till that time, okay, can you see? I already have the global administrator role assigned, but under assigned roles, you need to click on add assignments and provide the global administrator role and save it. Once you do that, then again log into portal.azure.com via the second account and try to create an application registration or a new user via the second account. You would be able to create it because you have now granted the second user global administrator role, but still you won't be able to see the subscriptions because the second user has not been assigned the subscription level access. So follow this concept and that should help you with understanding the difference between the Active Directory roles and subscription roles. Now, since we have already discussed the difference between an Active Directory role and Azure subscription roles, on the first day there was a question. That is, under users, what is the difference between an assigned role and an Azure role assignment? Assigned role is basically your Active Directory role, whereas Azure role assignment is the role at Azure level, that is subscription or resource subscription level. So in case if I log into Azure, if I click on Azure role assignment, it states that this user is owner across 2 different subscriptions. Whereas under assigned roles, I see that this user is a global administrator and a Power Platform administrator. I hope now you all are able to link the queries that we had in the initial sessions. Because until you understand the difference between the roles, you all never would have been able to understand the difference between these two. I hope now this is clear. What are assigned roles and what are Azure role assignments?
And then custom roles fall under which?
Custom role is Azure role assignments.
Azure role assignment.
See, there are 2 custom roles, correct? A custom role can be defined at an Azure Active Directory level as well, but unfortunately, I cannot do it, correct? Because of my free license of Entra. So Active Directory custom role will fall under assigned roles. Subscription level custom role will fall under Azure role assignments.
So both can have custom roles.
Yes. I'll show the custom role for the Azure subscription because that I can create, but I'll show it a couple of minutes later. But now I hope this query that we had, the difference between assigned roles and Azure role assignments is clear.
Just one question on the subscription. So subscription is what, like an offering or something? Microsoft offering?
Is a subscription
Paid
is
offering.
a paid offering. It's a paid credit. Like
Okay.
it's like consider as your credit card, correct? There are 2 types, credit card or a debit card, correct? Now in case of a debit card, you have fixed credit, correct? You cannot spend beyond that. That's your free subscription, wherein the free subscription that you have bought is basically $200 credit. Post that, the subscription would get disabled or become inactive. Whereas there is pay as you go subscription, that is as and how you use, you would get credited, that you would get that much amount of bill and you have to pay it. So subscription is your billing aspect that you can consider. Clear?
And then I have a question. Okay, so like the question is about subscription role. Okay, so why do we need to create like a subscription role? And like when suppose someone we have a new user, okay, do we need to create assign role in both, like in AD, Azure AD and subscription role?
Now you consider, that's the POC that I provided to you all, correct? This create the second user that would initially not have any roles and then have only global administrator role. Now consider in an organization, correct? There are multiple users, there are developers, there are executives, there are HRs, there are sales folks, correct? Do you think HR folks or executives would log into portal.azure.com and do any development in Azure portal? Or the sales representatives log in to Azure portal? No, correct? They do need access. Whenever a user joins an organization, a user needs to be created in the tenant. That's crystal clear. Now, there are certain roles in the Active Directory, like reader roles as well, correct? Imagine that as an executive, I do need to go and have the reader role in the users, correct? In case as in an organization, I want to search another user, correct? I want to have that reader role at an organization level, at an Active Directory reader role. But there is no reason for me to grant that executive or that HR access on a subscription. Subscription are developer credits, correct, for development purposes. So there is no need for me to grant him any access on the subscription level or anything. Now remember, there is not only subscription level, correct? Today we are discussing at a subscription level, but eventually we'll discuss the hierarchy at a subscription as well. That is tomorrow. At that time, you can understand that even if you do not grant access at a subscription level, you can grant access at its child level as well. But in layman terminology, folks like HR, sales, executives do not need developmental access. Azure portal is for developmental purposes, correct? So there is no need for them to get access at a subscription level. I hope you all are able to understand.
Yeah. So for developers, we create in AD and Azure AD and subscription as well,
Every
right?
developer, correct? Would every developer in an organization work on Azure? No, correct?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
only in architectural designing. Remember one clear aspect. It's concept of least privilege access. Only give access to users in case if they need it. Just because you have the role does not mean you have to give that role.
Okay.
In case within an organization there are 10 developers, not all 10 developers would be working on Azure portal, correct? There might be some workers or users who would be working on Excel or working on
Yeah.
PPT.
Yeah.
Correct. So only those who need the role would be provisioned with that.
Okay.
Hence, there are administrator roles within the organization to take care of such aspects. Not in case if anyone reaches out, I want a role, they don't blatantly give it. They ask, why do you need that role? Business justification, approvals, etc. Hence, there are critical roles within an organization for administrative purposes. Clear?
Yeah, clear. Thank you.
So now, within the subscription, there are certain inbuilt roles. Correct? But you can also, similar to how in the Active Directory there were inbuilt roles, you could create a custom role. But unfortunately, since ours is a free license, we cannot create it. But in case of a subscription, since we have paid the subscription, I can create a custom role. So in the custom role, I can define a specific permission that I want. Meaning I can add, I want x.read permission only. So I can define what permission I want to give within that role. Different set of permissions. Now I want to give permission at a data factory level only, which is Azure Data Factory, Microsoft Azure Data Factory. Now within that, I can grant it overall all permissions or just read only and delete data factory. So this is the custom role that I'm creating. And then I created this custom role at a subscription level. Remember, Active Directory role gets created at an Active Directory level. Subscription role gets created at a subscription level. Since I'm creating this role in this subscription and I'm having two subscriptions, this role won't get inherited in the other subscription. I have to explicitly create that role in the another subscription as well. So There are Active Directory level roles and there is subscription roles. And I can create custom roles across both. And under users, Azure role assignment is role assignment at an Azure subscription or some other aspect, the child hierarchy within the subscription. And role privilege is Azure role privileges that one has. Any queries up till now?
And then the last line, what you said, role privileges, do you set it separately?
So under users, assigned roles are basically Active Directory roles that a user
Correct.
is associated with, whereas Azure
Correct.
role assignment is the roles
Subscription.
that the user has at a Azure level. It can be Azure subscription or child items within that subscription. The child items we'll discuss tomorrow. What does the hierarchy within Azure subscription imply? Clear?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, this I was clear. Yeah.
So now the final query that we had in the initial session was with respect to the change Active Directory. Under subscription, under change directory, I had a functionality of switching across multiple tenants. Correct? And then I had to select this. Now you all read this. Now your understanding should be clear that when you change an Active Directory, imagine that I had created an Azure Data Factory in tenant A. Correct? So that, and I have an Azure SQL database. I have an Azure Data Factory and I have an Azure SQL database in this tenant. Now this Azure Data Factory has a managed identity within this tenant itself. And via that managed identity, I had given it access on this Azure SQL database. Since now I am moving the subscription from tenant A to tenant B, the user roles that I had assigned, correct? Because I might have created certain applications, service principals within this tenant. Now the service principals are scoped to the tenant. They cannot move because those are not code, correct? Those are users. So those cannot move from this tenant to the new tenant. It's only the code layer and the data that would move from this tenant to this tenant. Hence, the accesses that I have provided via service principal, etc., those won't move because those are bound to the tenant. That's what here is the acceptance, that when I'm changing the directory, it does not transfer some resources like access controls or user assigned managed identity, because those are bound to the corresponding directory only. They cannot move across the tenant or directory. I hope now, after understanding the concept of managed identity today, you'd understand what does this indicate.
Andran, sorry, I am confused a bit. See, they are bound to the directory and you are changing the directory itself, right? Then when we are changing the directory,
I am moving the code from this directory to that directory. Consider that. Let's understand in the layman terminology, correct? The entire building in which I reside is the tenant. Within that building, I have two subscription, meaning I have two home, GF3 and GF5. Correct? Now, imagine that I have to move from GF3 to GF5. Correct? I'll move all my furnitures, etc. from GF3 to GF5. But the windows that were part of the GF3 can't move to GF5, correct? Those would still remain there as is. Consider managed identities, or I had created a managed identity, correct? So the managed identity is bound to this tenant. User is bound to this tenant, correct? I am not moving the tenant. I am moving the subscription from one tenant to another tenant. The tenant, meaning the user that you created, correct, is a part of this tenant. You associated that user, managed identity, etc. to this subscription. But now, since you're moving this subscription from this tenant to another tenant, the managed identity is not bound to a subscription, it is bound to a tenant, correct? So that managed identity won't move from tenant 1 to tenant 2. So in that case, whatever automation, let's say you had created via that managed identity, you have to explicitly create a similar managed identity in the new tenant, grant similar privileges to that corresponding offering, and work on that. So it's your code layer and your data layer that is moving, but not the user layer and the access layer.
Got it.
Clear? So that's the warning that they're stating, that moving this won't move your managed roles, etc. Is it clear now?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
So this clears the concept of Azure Active Directory to a extent that we need for our future sessions. So I'll take a pause here. Any queries that we have across the last 3 to 4 sessions that we had, whatever queries we had, I have covered everything, because now you all are able to understand what managed identity is, and that itself helps us cover the other queries that we had in the previous sessions. So other than that, are there any other queries, sessions before we move ahead? Because now there would be some more hierarchical aspects that we would be discussing. So please be clear on any queries that you have or not. If
Nandan,
no,
can you explain the latest concept now about moving the
Sorry.
subscription for one tenant to another?
Okay. Let's say that in this subscription, I have an Azure SQL database created. Correct? Let's say a subscription is bound to ILDF 7 tenant, and within that subscription, I create an Azure SQL database. Now I need to grant some users access on the Azure SQL database for users or apps. So I created applications within the ILDF 7 tenant, and I granted some of the users within ILDF 7 tenant access on the Azure SQL database. In sync with me up till now? Now, when I move the subscription from ILDF 7 tenant to some X tenant, the Azure SQL database moves. Along with that, the data and the code aspect that is present within the database is now moved to the new tenant. But the users that were added within the Azure SQL database earlier were part of this tenant, correct? That is ILDF 7 tenant. Are those users present in the new tenant? No, correct? Because the new tenant would have another @xyz.com, unlike @yldf7.com. So the users that were present within the Azure SQL database would be in disabled or deprecated mode. Those won't move. So once you move the subscription from one tenant to another tenant, the code and the data layer moves, but the user access aspects you have to explicitly recreate again, because the users do not move from one tenant to another tenant in this. It's the subscription movement that is happening, not the tenant movement.
Okay.
Clear?
Okay. Yeah, got it.
So before we start the next session, let's take a 5-minute break and reconvene back.